Hello everyone, hope you're good, hope you're well. Today our lecture topic will be on the labor market and unemployment. Now most of us will participate in the labor market over the duration of our lives. Some people might try and fail and end up in unemployment. Now this is sad. Also, you might think it's unfair that some people do vital jobs like nurses, the police, and firefighters, and their pay is relatively low. Others, say bankers, footballers, earn a lot more money, right? So we'll be talking about this and how we get to this stage. So let's go. So our primary analysis will be about a perfectly competitive labor market. So let's talk about the supply of labor in a perfectly competitive labor market. Now, we know what our supply curve usually looks like, right? And in the labor market, the price for labor is wage, okay? And then we can have our quantity of labor in terms of the number of people working or that are demanded for to work. All right? Now, the supply of labor to an industry, usually in line with our supply curve, has an upward sloping supply curve. All right? So this means that at more wages, at higher wages, more people will want to work in that industry or in that sector. So more people will supply their labor services at higher wages. It makes sense, right? All right. Now, what determines the labor supply to a particular industry? Like we said, the labor wages, right? The level of wages. At higher wages, more labor would be supplied, and at lower wages, less labor would be supplied. Also, the value of benefits available from the government if people are unemployed. If people can get more money from unemployment, they will be less willing to supply their services to the labor market. All right. Next, we can talk about the training period, the time it takes to be qualified to supply your labor to the market. If the training period is long, for say example, doctors and surgeons, then the number of people who will be available to work in this sector at any given time would be low, right? Next, we can talk about the overall appeal of the job. Some jobs are dangerous, some jobs are nasty. So say firefighters do a very dangerous job, or some people might have to do things that are unpleasant. For instance, cleaning, for instance, or taking care of people who are very, very sick, right? Now, what will happen is that would reduce the amount of people willing to work in that market. Next, we can talk about the number of people in the labor force. So if there are more people in the labor force, so say the overall level of population of the country is higher, then there will be more people willing to supply their labor services. Next, we can talk about trade unions. If trade unions are very strong and they prevent people from joining them, once again, this would restrict the number of people who are able and willing to supply their services. Trade unions could also organize strikes and do other things to increase their wages. All right. Also, in the immediate run, the number of people willing to supply their labor services will be fixed. So maybe we'll have to train more people, and that would increase the quantity of labor. Now, what does that mean? All right. Anything that has to do with the level of wages supplying labor to that industry and the quantity of labor would imply a movement along the wage curve. Okay. So say for instance, if wages rise and more people want to supply their labor, then we'll just have this movement on the curve. If wages drop and less people want to supply their labor, then of course will come down. However, if wages stay the same and more people want to supply their labor services, then we would have a shift in the labor curve. Okay, say for instance the wages of doctors stay the same, but we're training more doctors, then we'll have a shift in the labor curve to the right. All right, if say for instance wages stay the same but there's a drop in population, then of course our movement would be to the left. Next, we can talk about the demand for labor in a perfectly competitive labor market. Right? Now, the demand for labor is a derived demand. So producers, manufacturers, retailers, businesses will demand for labor because labor helps to produce certain goods and services. This means that the demand for labor is derived from the demand for those goods and services. Once again, we can have a curve that shows wages and quantity of labor. And like our demand curve in perfect competition, our demand curve for labor is downward sloping. This means that at higher wages, producers, employers would want to demand for less labor because wages are higher, right? At lower wages, of course, the quantity of labor being demanded for will be higher, okay? So say I own a shop, right? And wages are high, you can only employ a certain number of people. If wages are low, of course, you can hire more people. So wages will determine the quantity of labor. Another thing that could determine the demand, the quantity of labor, would be the stock of capital, equipment, and technology, right? So the level of investment in capital goods will affect the productivity of employees and therefore the marginal revenue product of labor. So better capital equipment and technology should enable staff to produce more, and this will lead to an increase in their marginal revenue product of labor. So the additional revenue that each laborer can bring to the firm. So the additional output, right? Also, working practices and management approaches. So better management and better ways of organizing people can lead to improvements in the levels of output produced by employees. And you could talk about the implications for the quantity of labor. If we can organize people more and we don't need as much people, then maybe our demand for labor will drop, right? And if we can't do that, we'll need more employees. Also, training. If employees are better trained, they should be able to do their jobs better and more productively, and this will also increase their marginal revenue product of labor, okay? So the demand for labor is determined by the labor of each employee's output, and this we measure by the marginal revenue product of labor, the MRPL. So this depends on how much output is produced by an additional employee and the value of that output when it is sold. Okay? Right. So if we demand for more labor, if wages stay the same, right? So maybe for some reason, more people want our goods and our services, right? So we need more people and wages stay the same. Of course, our demand curve is going to shift to the right. If the opposite happens, if wages stay the same, but we need less people, then of course we are going to shift our demand for labor curve to the left in a perfectly competitive market. Now that we've talked about the supply of labor by the laborers themselves, those are the employees, and also the demand for labor by the producers, so the employers or whoever is hiring these laborers, we can bring it all together and talk about the demand and supply of labor in a perfectly competitive market and look at its effect on wage. Okay? Now, a firm in a perfectly competitive labor market is small relative to the entire industry. This means that each firm can hire as many employees as it wants, and it will not have any noticeable impact on the overall demand for labor in the industry. This means that each firm is a wage taker. All right, it has to hire as many people as it wants at a given wage. Right? Now, we know from microeconomics that we are at market equilibrium when the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. Now, in this case, we're at market equilibrium when the quantity supplied of labor is equal to the quantity demanded of labor, which is right here. Okay, so here the supply of labor is equal to the demand of labor. Now, what will happen if wages are set at a wage above the equilibrium? Okay, so say we set wages here, right? Now, what will happen? Well, in this case, you can see that there is excess supply of labor. Okay, so we are going to have a surplus of labor. Okay, what will happen in the other instance if wages are set below equilibrium? Okay, right? So if we set wages here, for instance, now you can see that in this case the demand for labor is higher than the supply of labor, so we are going to have excess demand. Okay, in other words, scarcity or shortage of labor. Okay, now of course you can see automatically that this surplus of labor is not a good thing. All right, so wages will have to drop till we get back to equilibrium, right? So because we have more people supplying their labor than they should, right, this excess supply of labor would allow employers to know that their wage rate is too high. So wage rate will drop till we get back to equilibrium. Conversely, if wages are too low, of course, there's going to be a shortage of laborers. There'll be an excess demand for workers, and then we're going to have to increase our wage till we get to market equilibrium. Now that we've talked about the demand and supply of labor in a perfectly competitive market, and we've covered its effect on wage, let's see what happens if we have a shift in any of our factors. So let's have wage on a vertical axis. Let's have quantity of labor on our horizontal axis. Our demand curve for labor, we said, is downward sloping. So at higher wages, employers will want to employ less, so they'll demand for less labor. And at lower wages, the quantity demanded of labor would be higher. And then we had an upward sloping supply curve. So at more wages, more people want to supply the services to the market. At lower wages, less people want to supply to the market. And we had our equilibrium, right? So if this is our equilibrium wage rate, and this is the equilibrium quantity of laborers, what will happen if there's an increase in the demand for labor at the same wage rate? Well, we'll have a shift in our demand curve, right? So we'll have this new demand curve right here. And of course, you can see that this, our new wage rate, will have to be higher, and we can hire more labor. Okay. What will happen, on the other hand, if we had an increase in the supply of labor, okay, at the same wage rate? this was our previous wage rates, and this is our previous quantity, and now we have an increase in the supply of labor, the same wage rate. Well, you can see that wages will drop because there are more people willing to supply their services, and we can hire more people. All right. Now we can talk about unemployment. Unemployment is a measure of the number of jobless people who want to work, are available to work, and are actively seeking employment. So note the terms. They want to work, they are available to work, and they are actively seeking employment as opposed to not seeking employment. How do we measure unemployment? Well, you can have the claimant count method. So this measures the number of individuals actually claiming unemployment related benefits at any moment. Or you could have the labor force survey. And this way we can measure unemployment based on interviews with people to find out who wants to work but is not employed. The labor force survey is now the official way of measuring unemployment in the UK. So how do we measure unemployment? We usually do this via the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate is calculated by dividing the number of unemployed persons by the labor force. And the labor force consists of both employed people and unemployed people. So the labor force includes employed people and unemployed people. So what causes unemployment? Well, here we'll be considering the 5 major causes of unemployment. The first one is cyclical or demand deficient unemployment. This relates to cyclical trends in growth and production that occur within the business cycle. So when business cycles are at their peak, cyclical unemployment will be low because total economic output is being maximized. When the business cycles are low and GDP drops, cyclical unemployment will be high. Next, we can talk about structural unemployment. And this is unemployment resulting from industrial reorganization, typically due to technological change, rather than fluctuations in supply and demand. So cyclical unemployment will occur because demand drops, right? Okay? The business cycle is at a low point, GDP is dropping, and unemployment will increase. Structural unemployment, on the other hand, occurs due to technological change. All right, so machines or robots taking the jobs of individuals. Next, we can talk about seasonal unemployment. This occurs when people are unemployed at certain times of the year because they work in industries where they are not needed all year round. So the tourism industry, for instance, the tourism industry will need more people in summer or in periods where people are on holiday. Think about Santa Claus. Santa Claus will only be needed during Christmas. So maybe at other times of the year, he would be unemployed. All right. So seasonal unemployment happens because the demand for the labor or the goods and services that is derived from these laborers is not needed all year round. Next, we can talk about frictional or surge unemployment. This is unemployment which exists in any economy due to people being in the process of moving from one job to another. All right, so when people are searching for new jobs or moving from one job to the next. All right, and this is why we need job websites like Indeed.co or the unemployment office. All right, or jobs.ac.uk, right? So we're hoping that these places will help people to get jobs quicker. Next, we can talk about classical real wage unemployment. And this occurs when real wages are kept above the market clearing wage, leading to a surplus of labor supplied. So remember what we said? Where you have your wage, your quantity of labor, right? You have your supply of labor, you have your demand for labor, and here you're at equilibrium. If you have a situation where wages are kept above the equilibrium, so say wages are kept here, for instance, and of course you will have a surplus of labor, okay? And this surplus that is not needed could lead to classical real wage unemployment. Let's talk about voluntary unemployment. Voluntary unemployment refers to the number of people who are looking for work but not yet willing to accept work at the given real wage rate. So maybe they're in the labor force, but they're not willing to accept a job at the going real wage. Involuntary unemployment, however, is more nasty than voluntary unemployment. And this is the number of people who are willing and able to work at the given real wage, but who are not in employment. This is usually due to a lack of demand in the economy. Now we can talk about the natural rate of unemployment. This is the level of unemployment when all those willing and able to work at the given real wage are working. The natural rate of unemployment is the long-run equilibrium rate of unemployment. This means there is no pressure for wages or prices to change. At the given real wage, the economy is settled for the long term. Some economists call it the natural rate or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. NAIRU, N-A-I-R-U. Why does this happen? Because at full employment, there will still be voluntary unemployment, all right? Or there could be people who are in frictional unemployment, all right? So moving between jobs or just have no intention of working. So people who don't want to work or people in voluntary employment, all right? So you would still have some measure of unemployment at this level, and this is the natural rate of unemployment. So how can we reduce unemployment? Well, we can reduce unemployment by engaging in supply-side policies to increase the supply of laborers or demand-side policies to increase the demand for the goods and services that these laborers produce. Remember, we said employment is a derived demand. Okay, so let's focus on supply-side policies on this slide. On the next slide, we'll focus on the demand-side policies. So let's focus on supply-side policies. Now, with supply-side policies, what we do is try to increase the skills of the workforce or to get them to accept jobs. Okay, so how can we do this? We can invest in training to provide the skills that people need to get jobs in other industries. Say, for instance, people are unemployed in one industry, but their jobs in another industry, say for instance coal mining or the steel industry, unfortunately lays off people, but their jobs in the IT industry. Well, we can invest in training to get people to get jobs in IT or in the other industries. We can change the benefits and tax system to make being unemployed less of an option. So this will force people to accept jobs. We can also reduce the tax wedge. The tax wedge is the difference between before tax and after tax wages. Okay, so if we're taxing workers too much, we might want to reduce it. So the tax wedge measures how much the government receives as a result of taxing the labor force. Also, we can provide more information so that employees know what jobs are available. Okay, so if employees know what jobs are available, hopefully they'll get those jobs. And maybe that's why we need job centers and the like. Okay, so websites to allow people to get more jobs. Next, like I said in the previous slide, we can engage in demand-side policies to reduce unemployment. So demand side policies will try to boost aggregate demand and provide jobs for those who are involuntarily employed. So that is individuals who have the necessary skills and who want to work, but for whom there have been a lack of jobs available. How can we do this? Well, our demand side policies could include cutting direct taxes to boost spending by firms and households. So if taxes reduce for firms, for instance, they can invest more in more firms, they can hire more workers, they can invest in more technology, they can invest in providing more goods and services because they have more money. Also, if taxes reduce for households, then these households will have more money to spend on goods and services, and hence will have to derive the demand for labor, because we said labor is a derived demand. Okay. Also, we can increase government spending. So say the government spends more on hospitals, on roads, on schools, on bridges, it'll need to hire workers, right? And this will reduce unemployment. Also, we can reduce interest rates to stimulate borrowing and spending. So if interest rates go down, people will borrow more money and they will spend it in the economy, right? If interest rates go up, then it's less attractive to spend and it's more attractive to put your money in the bank, like we've said in previous lectures. So these are some demand side policies. Of course, there are more general things we can do to reduce unemployment. For instance, stimulating entrepreneurship so people can create more jobs, giving our young ones or unemployed people skills to get jobs, and generally creating a favorable business climate. Okay, your class activity for the week is a simple one. How can we reduce unemployment in the